So, I'm going to be covering two aspects, which is the selection of the provider and awarding the contract, and also the delivery. So, my background is in mainly contract delivery. So, which one do I hit? That one. So, right, so here we are. This is where we are in the process. So, the purpose of the guide is as a document you can easily read. As a project manager, we have many tasks on at the same time. We tend to be short of time. So one of the things that I found in my career so far is that it wasn't easy to find answers to some of the questions that come up that I wasn't particularly familiar with at the time. So particularly in contracts, and I'll go into how that happened over a few of my experiences. But the idea of the guide was, when I heard about it from John about 8 years ago, was that in fact something that was easy to get into and understand, not necessarily going down to the absolute depths of detail, which there are many volumes around for that, but to actually make it an easy and accessible way for mainly project managers to, in their hard day jobs, to be able to say, oh gosh, what's happening here? Oh, I'll have a look at the guide. And then you can either read the whole thing and go through each of the segments, or you can just say, oh, where am I now at the moment? Oh, I should have prepared some, I should have been in the team that was preparing the contract terms. What have they done? Where am I, where am I starting? I noticed that we have a diverse audience, different sectors, which is good. So I hope that what we're saying will cover those sectors. It's supposed to be generalistic, and I know the APM tends to have been very much in the construction industry, but is now moving far more diversely, and it's I'm from the R&D and science and technology sector, so I'm contributing, so hopefully it's going to be as diverse as we can make it. So it looks also like the audience are quite experienced from what I've heard so far, so I hope this is going to be of use to you. You probably know, let's say 70%, if there's another 30% that helps you, then that's going to be worthwhile. So we all have these challenges today: resourcing our projects, the speed of developments, the availability of stakeholders, the modern challenges of the way we do business, the fact that we can't get together in a room like this very often these days usually. In fact, on the committee, we seldom get together. We're on the phone most of the time, aren't we? And it's we have to conduct our business in the way that we conduct our normal business, apart from the fact we also work. So it's not as easy as it sounds to be on the committee. So the SIG, in my estimation, is one of the, how many SIGs are there? 15? One of the SIGs where the whole idea of the SIGs is to bring in new ideas and to move the industry forward, and to help with the background of the body of knowledge, 6th edition, but actually helping in more depth on each of the elements within that. And so what we tend to have in the SIGs is a diversity of people, some people with a lot of experience, like myself and John, and then other people that come in that maybe not as much experience but still can contribute and give in new ideas. So I think it's a really a great thing that the APM has, having 15 SIGs which are contributing in, and the next issue of the book will probably have some more sections in along that way. So the idea here is to contribute. We've done this guide, which is clearly, it's not a thin volume, it's not a massive volume, but it's in between. It's actually 196 pages, and in that we've tried to compress all of this into a format that can be easily read. Now, in the book itself, does anyone know how many pages would cover procurement?
3.
something like that. I think if you really search through about 4 or 5 pages. Now, we did actually put some input into the block, but we realised that if you had 196 pages and you had that for each of the sections, it would not be manageable. So we hope that this will be an addition to the block which is compatible with it. And when you read it, you will probably have seen, if you've got the copy, that we actually refer back to the block within the document. So it should not be controversial or contradictory to what we...
contradictory in some instances.
Well, definition, it's in a good way. So it's a stake in the ground. There probably will be, updates and more documents coming out. So, one of the good things about, or one of good or bad really, is you end up, when you're a project manager, whatever comes in the door is what you're working on, or asked to work on. You don't usually have a choice, you're going to work on it. And what's happened before and what's happened after, what's going to happen after, are two different things. So you might have been, if you've been lucky, involved all the way down this at the beginning, and you're very thoroughly briefed and you understand. On the other hand, I've been on projects, and very rarely has that been the case, and I've actually ended up either at this stage or mostly at this stage when most of this work has been done, if it's been done in any particular depth, and then you're asked to, you are the project manager, therefore you need to deliver it. But the good thing about knowing the process is that if you are there, you can look back and see what hasn't been done, and then you also can look forward to see what's going to need to be done. And by knowing those differences, if there are differences in the past, then you should make it a bit easier to manage. I noticed there was a few comments about kind of blinkered departments, like commercial departments tend to think that they rule everything. That can be the case. I've found in a number of places. There's sort of a dominance there where the project manager, in some cases, doesn't even get a contract copy and has to kind of beg for it. Has anyone come across that? Yeah. It's sort of crazy, but it happens. So one of the things is make sure that you do get the contract and make sure that you read it. So the role of the PM is delivery, and that's where the fun starts, of course, because everyone else disappears. I mean, if you're the project manager and if you're subcontracting to other companies, because you know how much dust there is on the carpet, because people go past your desk so fast that the dust rises quite quickly. So on to the next one. Thanks, John. So just about me a little bit, about 30 plus, I wouldn't like to say how many more than that as a PM, mostly in the IT technology sector, but that branches out into other areas as well. Worked in very small companies up to quite large corporations. As I say, CMP since 2009. Let's say I'm the secretary and been able to contribute quite a bit at the moment. As with all SIGs, I have an interest in helping others with my experience in the small way that I can, in actually, when you put it from an experienced person, then in fact you might just have some information that you might not have found in a textbook. So, yes, I'm in the technology sector. John was saying about one of his jobs that he had in New Zealand, out on a very isolated place. I've done that because I did a technological project in Tasmania. This was on the outskirts of Hobart, which was a high-tech, high-frequency radio direction finding system, which is quite a complex thing to do because any metal at the HF 3 to 30 megahertz, I won't go into detail, but metal causes all sorts of trouble. So you have to demolish anything that was metal around. It was on top of a rocky hill, 500 meters high, and it had to have 8 totally identical antennas placed to within millimetres in order to work. And also any metal, which all the cables had to be buried 3 metres underground, and it was rocky, so I'm talking boulders as tall as this room. So that was kind of diverse because we had to use local contractors, we had to manage that. So we did it very, I'm glad to say, quite successfully. So we're going to cover assessing the situation when you first come into the project, what's already been done, the context of it, the objectives and principles that you need to have in the selection process in this particular case, the selection process itself, and how to use the Contracts and Procurement Guide, which will also feed through into the delivery section I'm doing. We're going to revisit our mini exercises, and then we'll summarise. Okay, yeah. So, what everyone asks me is, what can go wrong? I used to do these presentations and go through all the process, and then everyone was kind of, and then fall asleep. And then I get to the end, near the end, and say, well, actually, I've got these things that have gone wrong. And they sort of, what? Gone wrong? That's what I want to know. So I actually turned most of the presentations on their head and actually looked at what can go wrong, and then gone back to the process from there. So I thought this was quite an interesting slide, because actually it might be quite humorous, but in fact it's amazing how when you write something down, some people interpret it one way and others completely different. The same, we know this from email. You've got to be very careful with email, because when you say something you may have made a mistake, or it might just come over differently to another person. So one of the things that can go wrong is certainly the way that you communicate with your contractors, and indeed all stakeholders, and are they actually listening and hearing what you're expecting, you think they're hearing. So that's always got to be looked at. Next one. I think this is what went on the internet to see where there were things that could be interesting to put up on slides, a bit of fun. So we can go to the next one. It says here original contract, and here it says change order. So somebody had a humorous idea here where in fact what their business was all about was actually, once they got the contract, get as much out of it as possible. And how many people have come across the idea of upselling from contractors? Yeah. Upselling's okay, but if it's actually upselling what there's already contracted, you think they're contracted to do, it's not so good. And I've come across that a few times where going through the contract you find suddenly a change order comes to you because you wanted to change what we thought was quite a minor thing, and what's happened is they've put on every bit of the cost that they've overrun into that change order. And this happened to me, and I'm not going to say what company it was, but it was an American company, and at the end of that, the project, we had a sort of a get-together and started talking about it, and they said, oh yeah, that's our strategy, we always do the upselling, we go in low and then we try and upsell it. So sometimes it can actually be the strategy. So, you may have seen this diagram, it was up on the projector earlier, and it's not something that people always understand. It's actually from a lady called Bernice Rock, who did some research on this, and the idea is that, yes, everyone knows once you're investing in a project, the risk goes high because you put a lot of money in, and if it fails, that money is potentially wasted. So everyone looks at it in that way. But actually, the other side of that is your influential position on the outcome actually reduces. In fact, at the beginning, choosing your contractor is one of the main decisions that can determine the outcome. So it means that actually, proportionately, you should be putting as much time as you can in there in order to avoid potential problems, because that's what we want to do. We don't want to hit the problems, in managing a contract, we need to try and avoid them and address them before they become issues. The other thing to talk about is the type of relationship that you're going to go into, which has a range. And also, it also determines the risk element that you're putting into the management of your contractor, or where you're procuring from, that in fact they could become quite an important factor in the delivery of the whole project. So when you determine what kind of relationship you're going to have, you need to take into account what the consequences could be and manage the people accordingly. So objectives of when we're looking at selecting a provider, we need to understand all these factors at the beginning of the selection process. Now, if you've come into this and you've not been through all the contractual work that's gone on before, in fact, it may be that the contractual work was never done and you're starting from scratch. These are the main things that we need to really understand on the project as a whole. What we need to buy, what exactly that is, not in terms of a technical spec, but in terms of an outcome at the end of the project, which will include how that will be managed and how it will be paid, what the risk factors are, how we're going to apportion risk. How are we going to obtain it? Is it going to be an in-house? Is there an in-house factor, or is it all going to be contracted? So be clear about what you think is necessary there. And sometimes you need to have both options available. When do we need it? That's very important because you need to understand lead times which are going to be needed to influence the project. So you might want to try to use a larger company that has a lot of resources to get something early and pay a bit more, in which case that's a critical item that has to come in at a certain time. Or you might have a bit longer time and go out further out into the market to try and reduce your costs. How much is our budget? Well, that's something should have been determined a bit earlier, but sometimes people are a bit hazy about that. So as a project manager, before we go out and select someone, we need to have a pretty good idea of the overall budget for the project, which might be determined by the way the contract's drafted, and how much is in-house and how much we're trying to contract and how critical it is. And then a wider theme is what is the overall uncertainty appetite. So you might be in a company that is very risk averse, or for some reason has it must be seen to be always right, in which case you would need to put enough work into reducing the uncertainty to make it almost certain the way we think we go, which takes time, takes effort, and can be, let's say, costly. Or if you're in an industry that kind of has diverse applications and are used to risk, then you can put more into knowing the risks and being in a position to do a calculation. It could be a sort of statistical calculation to determine a risk budget, which is based upon the spread of risks, which is still within a budget that's allowable for that project. So these items depend on the criticality of the project, of the criticality to our project, the operational risk when the thing is delivered, and the complexity. So principles when you're going to be selecting are a defined process so that everyone knows where you are in the process and what's to follow, and can be explained to your bidders. Governance, who's going to be in charge, How do you know that things are being done, and if you have an issue, where do you go? Governance could also mean if you have to comply with legislation, perhaps EU procurement regulations or other types of regulation of that type. The relevance of your questions, when you ask a supplier what they're going to provide, you need to make sure that it's basically what the question means something and not some irrelevance in there. Clarity throughout the whole process, what the process is, how the decisions are going to be made, the various marking criteria, how it's going to be judged, what you're going to do. Are you going to have trials to try things out? Do you want samples? That kind of thing. Fairness. So that's where records come in. It's very important that we have records of all of the decisions made, and indeed how the final ultimate decision is made to select a provider, because other providers may well challenge that. And documentation and records quite often are not as good as they should be, and also address IPR is the next point, because you're dealing with inputs from various sources. The intellectual property of those sources needs to be protected where necessary. The only real way you can do that is to have a management system and make sure that you keep the records in the right place, and make sure everyone in the project knows that it's got to be kept within those particular areas. And red flags, these are things that you spot whilst you're running the process, that start your hackles rising. Oh, there's a problem here. In the guide, we've got a section, a chapter, I think it's chapter 3 or chapter 6, appendix C. So appendix C, sorry. And that's the red flags, which are the things that you should be spotting and what it could mean in the process. So very important to act on those. So selection criteria, there are all these factors. It's a matter of judgment at the end of the day, but then you need to make sure that you've weighted each factor accordingly to the job. And in that case, you would have a matrix of each of these items well defined, and that would be the way that you then manage the selection. In some cases, if it's a very complex project, then you might be looking for factors of experience in the provider that you have got in-house, and that they can take some of the risk away from you if they're able to in their size and their capabilities, if they can manage that risk themselves. Culture is pretty important, because when I say culture, I mean the ways of working. Some companies have not very good record keeping and are not used to working in providing complex solutions, and you need to take that into account as to whether they're used to the way you're working, or if you have to make any compensations for that, add any additional systems in to contend for the fact they may not be normally in that mode of operation. For example, in research, and particularly in defence, which is where I'm working at the moment, we're trying to diversify the supplier base, i.e. not go to the same big companies that we all know that do defence all the time, but also bring in like universities and small SMEs to do the work. The problem there is, of course, there are certain constraints in particular in the defence industry, but also in other industries, in security, management of data, and that kind of thing. So if you're going to go wider than the norms, then you have to have systems that those companies can use, and add those into your calculations so that you provide the tools that are necessary. So that's an additional cost. But it could end up that you get far better ideas coming in to your work, in which case that pays off. So going on to the inputs, In the guide, we've got sections on, in each of the sections, it's got inputs, then it's got the process, then it's got the outputs, and it talks about risks in some areas. So inputs, importantly, is the availability of the group that's going to be working on the selection, and indeed definition of it, because it's important that when you make decisions that correct governance has been done and that's recorded. Quite often people that are in position of authority aren't that available, so they just need to be made known that they need to be available in order to give their input to these decisions. And in fact, the best way to do that is to structure it in some form of document which shows who's doing what. The business case and the procurement management plan documents, those should have been provided earlier in the process, which you'll have seen in the other chapters. But if they haven't been, then they need to be generated so that you know what in fact you are doing in this procurement. Availability of knowledge, specialist knowledge to judge things, need to be properly qualified. Not easy to obtain sometimes because people tend to move around or retire. People that have the experience may not be in your own company, you may have to employ some consultants. Make sure that you've got the correct level of experience there. In particular, in the legal side of things, that's a very it's not something that a man in the street would normally be able to judge. It needs experience and knowledge of history, of what's happened in the past.
Shall I go to you, Steve?
Yeah. The requirement and nature of the work and the ballpark monetary value that you're expecting it to cost, and the final contract terms. Yeah. So this is the process of selection. It's pretty generic, and it's meant to be a diagram that gives you the whole idea of the picture. Even if you actually know, a lot of people might know the way that this works, but it's something that you can pick up and just say, well, okay, what do I do next? What my inputs are, which are also in the text in the guide. And then how the process would normally proceed. So clearly you need to understand what the best value is going to be. You need to have appointed the provider selection panel, or else that might just be the program manager, depending on the size of the endeavour. Pre-qualification questionnaire. Another thing is, how far out are you going to go? How many people do you want to respond? Is it something that's innovative and you don't really know what you're looking for? You need people to come back to you with ideas. Then you would go out widely to get input. Or if it's something more specific, it may not need to be quite such a wide trawl of companies. So you would generate a preliminary questionnaire which would be well structured and then get answers from the people that are bidding. And from that, well, we would have developed a long list in order to send that out to. We then look, once they've responded, evaluate and down select to using a well-defined process and a scoring matrix that is also published to the providers. Quite often you get more than you need, so you might have to go around the cycle again with a more comprehensive questionnaire. And then after that, we look at how we're going to actually select the final provider. So in doing that, we go out with a more detailed spec, and the tenders write their responses, look at whether there needs to be reality checks, i.e. presentations, are they really able to provide what they say they are? Can we see something? Can we see what you've done before? And do this evaluation and down selection. There could then be a series of clarifications because providers can have their own ideas. That needs to be published. If there's a question that comes back and there's an answer that's given, that answer needs to go to all of the providers so that it's a fair situation. Coming out of that, we have the outputs which we would hope to be able to award the contract at that time. The final contract terms should have been completely generated. Final requirements, any technical documents, any statements of work which need to be not contentious with the contract. Sometimes I would put them as an annex to make sure that it was not contentious with the main contract. And the provider's proposal against that, which should not have any changes to what you're asking in the contract. So if there's any change to the contract, then that null and voids it. So it needs to be exactly against what you put out to them at that point. So yeah, what it is basically you're under contract, you have the records of the process, and make sure that the full set of finally agreed documents supplied by the employer, that they have not made any amendments to those. Yeah.
Right, we're meant to be back at 3, which gives us 13 minutes to have a coffee or a tea and be back.